So first off, thank you for having me. This is my first innovation rodeo. So I'm going to be coming kind of from a different angle than I think a lot of what we've talked about today. So just because it is my first, and it's actually a lot of new faces in here for me, I would appreciate to know who's in the room. So who's heard of Phius? Okay, actually way higher than I thought. So I'm not even going to ask about Passive House, but Phius stands for, or did stand for, Passive House Institute US. So we're a nonprofit that is essentially trying to make high-performance passive building mainstream. And we do this by setting building standards, building performance standards. So I think a lot of what Brian was talking about, we align really well. They're a partner organization. We train and certify professionals to build and verify and design these buildings. And then we also certify products that go into these buildings. So kind of trying to attack it from all different angles. I'm not really going to talk about passive buildings much, but I'm going to talk about kind of how passive building and how building designers, building operators fit into the transition to a renewable future. So let's see, Phius's mission is to make high-performance passive building mainstream, but that's really, we're trying to reduce carbon emissions, right? We're trying to allow buildings to be more high-performance, net zero I'll talk about, but ultimately to combat climate change. So it's really all about the CO2 emission reduction. So there's a lot of things that us as the building design and delivery and operations team can do beyond the building to kind of work outside of our individual little silos. And I kind of want to just dip our toes into GEBs. We'll talk about GEBs, microgrids and passive building, and how these all kind of interact and what the potential for us to be a part of that renewable transition as the building end of it. So architects in the room? Okay, that's the lowest number I've ever spoken to, I think. Engineers? Okay, good. I'm an engineer, so this will work. Utilities? Okay, you can correct me if I'm wrong on anything up here. Is there anything else? Real estate, I guess? Yeah. Okay, so I think we covered most of it. Good. Okay. Oh, and also Phius is we're a national organization, actually international in terms of our projects, but we're located just a mile away, downtown Chicago, so our offices are just down the street, so it's nice to be in our city here and see local faces. Okay, so many of us don't think about where our power comes from, right? We flip a light switch on and it's on, right? Until there's an outage, and then everyone's all up in arms, right? You're very upset. We expect in the US, we expect this uninterruptible power supply. And we're gonna get into kind of what it takes to get that electron to you. So the grid is often called, by the people that talk about the grid, the biggest machine on Earth. So it's made up of 3 different interconnections that aren't actually connected by wires. And it's run by these different independent service operators, or ISOs. And right now, the electric grid is typically a one-way power flow. You have generation, transmission at high voltages, and then step down to distribution at lower voltages, and then the customer load, which is here at this building. And the customer increases their load, they need more power, right? And the grid has to respond instantaneously and increase demand. Or increased supply, sorry. And it's actually a fairly vulnerable network. And relative to a lot of the technology we have today, fairly antiquated as well, in terms of it being a one-way communication system. The generation just always has to respond to what the building needs. And in the US right now, I'm realizing my mic should be more centered, but sorry. In the US right now, our resources are made up of various generation resources, various fuels that produce electricity. So about a third is natural gas, 22% coal, 20% nuclear, 14% renewables, 7% hydropower. But we know this is changing, right? We're getting more and more renewables. The EIA forecasts this, yes, we're seeing it, lots more renewables, commitments to renewables and things like that. And if you look at the electricity load that the grid has to meet, it's also right now fairly predictable. So there's different seasonal load profiles on the grid. The winter has kind of this morning hump and afternoon or late evening hump, and then the summer has this kind of big middle of the day hump. And these different times of the day are met with different resources. So this kind of, the bottom, this base load that's consistent, is met with base load resources. So this is coal, nuclear, some renewables. This is mostly constrained to like a constant output. So they're kind of steady. Intermediate is load following resources, natural gas combined cycle and some renewables. And then peaking plants, I think more people are maybe familiar with peaker plants now. Typically natural gas, super quick responding. They're generally running at all times and then just called upon when needed at peaks. And in terms of the capacity we have and the amount of time that it's utilized, basically base load's utilized all the time, load following to follow the load, and then peaks for a very small amount of time. But those are very expensive to maintain and a lot of what drives that marginal electricity cost. And in the US right now, we have about 3 times more than we actually need in terms of generation capacity. So if everything ran all out, all the time, we'd have 3 times more energy than we need. And it's because we're sizing the whole grid capacity for these peaks. So lots of engineers in here, mechanical system sizing, you pick the, whatever design condition and you size the equipment, plus a buffer factor, who knows what, right? But that's happening at like a huge scale here. So we kind of understand the concept, and it's really because we expect this uninterruptible power supply, and it's one-way communication. And in terms of what that looks like in terms of cost and meeting that load, basically resources bid into the market, and the cheapest ones go first. And it's generally renewables because they don't have a marginal cost, they don't fuel cost. And then as that load increases, you have to call upon the more and more expensive resources to meet it. So there's a lot of charts in here, I'm just going to be frank. This is a daily load profile, like midnight to midnight. And then on the y-axis is power. So as power increases or energy use, power draw increases over the course of the day, it's more and more expensive to meet that. So on the left is a chart of like real-time pricing for Chicago. So a lot of us pay flat rates for electricity, right? And that's kind of an insurance policy that you're going to be delivered electricity at a certain price. But in reality, it's a very dynamic thing based on the actual grid mix serving your load at that point in time. So another way to look at it is as the demand goes up over the course of the day, you're calling upon these more least expensive resources, and then it's going up and up and up, right, as the demand increases, or to the right. And notice it's not linear, right? At a certain point, it's a lot more expensive to get that next kilowatt hour. And because it's so dynamic, and because there's a different grid mix serving the building at different times, the emissions associated with it are also very dynamic. And Chicago is not a crazy dynamic grid in terms of our mix of resources, but there's actually a significant difference between the best hour and the worst hour in terms of the emissions of that next kilowatt hour you use in the building. If you look at a place with high renewable energy penetration, it gets really, really different. Some hours you have very clean energy, abundance of energy, and some hours you have very dirty energy. So in reality, this is the months of the year. This is real data from 2019, months of the year and times of the day. In reality, if you use a kilowatt hour during the red times, it's actually worse in terms of emissions than if you use a kilowatt hour in those green times. So timing is really important. But generally, when we're doing building energy modeling, planning, accounting even with building performance standards, this is how we look at energy use, right? Like every kilowatt hour is the same. And in reality, that's just not true. So there's different ISOs, as I showed in the beginning, and you can go in and look at their daily load profiles. It's very exciting websites. And you can see there's a forecast and an actual load of the day. So this is about 2 months ago now. The demand curve in that day in the New England ISO. So you can see, it's got the little summer hump. Notice the y-axis doesn't start at 0. So there's a base load under this. And you can look at the generation resources meeting that load at any given time. So this follows the exact trends we'd expect. We have renewables and hydro at the bottom as base load, consistent. Nuclear could not be any flatter, consistent output from nuclear. And then you have the natural gas load following. And so these are the different generation resources that are consistently meeting that load over the course of the day. And what's interesting is over the past maybe year, I don't look at this website every day, but they added at some point an estimate of behind the meter solar. So this is the New England ISO, a lot of incentives for adding solar to buildings, net zero, things like that. And when you go behind the meter, the utility is now blind to the energy production there. So we saw the net load here, this line, right? But the actual load that the grid would have, despite that solar, would be this orange line. So we're running into some challenges here where they don't actually know the load on the grid, and they're having to estimate the actual load, including the behind the meter solar, okay? And the grid is changing. So that was one representation of how it's changing, but we know things are electrifying. We're electrifying buildings, we're electrifying cars. We have distributed energy resources. And we're starting to digitalize and make things smarter, hopefully open up different communication pathways for buildings. And the best example of looking at a new grid is California. So that same day in July, 2 months ago, in California, the demand, the renewables trend. So yes, we all know California is very ahead in terms of solar, right? And this is the net demand on the grid. So we'll look at the duck curve. If you guys don't know the duck curve, we'll talk about it. But essentially what's happening is this net load is due to all the renewables that are either behind or in front of the meter. And the net load is, this purple line is what the grid is left to meet at the end of the day. We'll get deeper into that. The other thing that's happening is there's a lot of curtailment. So there's surplus of renewable energy and it's not being able to be used at the building load. And this chart's that same day. We saw all the solar in the middle of the day, right? There's two main types of curtailment happening in this chart. These also, I just picked a random day. They all kind of look the same in the same season, so this is not a particularly interesting day. It's just, this happens all the time. So the two types of curtailment that are happening is, the big one in green is mitigating local congestion. And what that means is that the transmission lines don't have capacity to get the power to the load, basically. So they have a lot of solar on one end, transmission lines can't carry it. The other, the blue, is mitigating system-wide oversupply. So they have surplus energy. We've seen negative electricity prices, this is what's happening. So they have to curtail renewable energy. And they're not in any way at 100% renewables or anything in California. I mean, they're getting there, they're adding some, but they're not anywhere near where we're trying to be in 10 years. So this is happening without even really getting close to the goals that we're trying to achieve. And, okay. So this is a kind of projection to 2050 in terms of the different the different generation resources, their capacity on the right, and the generation on the left. And this comes from a model from NREL called Cambium, and it's their mid-case scenario, which basically means any policies that are in place today, if those followed through, this is what it would look like. So it's fairly realistic, maybe even pessimistic, saying there won't be new policies before then. So on the right is the capacity, and that's the actual infrastructure needed. So you can see a big increase in solar, like very big, tenfold maybe. Distributed and utility, not a lot of decrease in the fossil fuels, right? And a big increase in storage. And then on the left is the actual mix of the generation resources generating the energy. So it's the terawatt hours that come out of it. And the left is what determines the actual emissions. So the mix of all the fossil, you see how much of that is fossil fuel based, maybe about half, and the other half about renewables. So what we're trying to do, ultimately, that I'll get into a little deeper, is increase the utilization of all of this renewable capacity that we're planning. and decrease utilization of those bottom colors, the purple, the black, the red, the non-renewable energy. One thing to point out is that purple on the right, that's the peaking plants. You can see there's a good amount of capacity, but it's barely ever used on the left, right? It doesn't really show up in the generation. We have to pay for that. Okay, so the transition to this renewable future really, as the building, delivery, design, operations team, we need to think about how the decisions at our building scale impact the greater scale, beyond the building. So, I'm going to look at a couple of challenges, changes, maybe opportunities also, should add that here. I think it's very clear that there's a decarbonization movement. I think you all in this room would agree. I'm not the first one to talk about this. So I want to frame what this kind of grid discussion in the context of these three items. So net zero buildings, I just heard from Brian, or we all just heard from Brian, there's a goal for a certain amount of net zero building penetration by 2040. So this is happening. This is a goal for many organizations, Phius being one, but I think we can get beyond it, and I'll talk about that. Things are being electrified, definitely know that. And then we're taking our dispatchable, or our resources that we know are available, burning fossil fuels, we're taking those and shifting to variable renewable resources. So it's not that, we can't predict when the sun's going to shine, but we can't always just call upon the sun to shine or the wind to blow, right? So we're changing fundamentally the structure of the generation resources that we have available. Okay. So starting with net zero, I just really want to point out that I'm a proponent of net zero. Phius is a zero energy standard, but it doesn't mean there's no emissions. It doesn't mean you don't need the grid. It doesn't mean you're off grid. It's a good goal, but ultimately what net zero means, for those that aren't familiar, is that you generate the same amount of energy on site or off site, renewable energy, that you use on an annual basis. So I use 1,000 over the course of the year, and I also generate 1,000. But it doesn't look at daily, it doesn't look at hourly, it doesn't look at seasonally, it's an annual net zero. And you can see just generally this graphic shows a typical building load profile in red, and then the blue is the energy use offsetting it, the solar. So timing is important because net zero isn't addressing timing, okay? So we're gonna look at timing. Just briefly showing a case study here. I should have brought my timer over here, but that's okay. Okay, so this is not a real building, it could be I guess, but it's a prototypical DOE building in Chicago, 32 units, about 1,000 square feet per unit, and looking at kind of two flavors of net zero, as I'll call them. One meets code and adds PV, one meets Phius, which is the only part I really talk about Phius, and adds PV to get to zero. But they're both ultimately net zero buildings by definition by adding photovoltaic energy. Photovoltaic panels. And the baseline building needs 290 kilowatt PV array, and the passive building needs about half, okay, to get to zero over the course of the year. For those that aren't familiar with passive building, just very briefly, this is an annual energy load profile, not a real one, but a diagram. So you can see that this is Chicago. The baseline building uses a lot of heating, a lot of cooling, has some sort of base load. With passive building, you essentially take passive building strategies, better insulation, air tightness, balanced ventilation, improved solar performance or window performance, and you slash those loads. So you cut down the peaks and the annuals of heating and cooling. And that's really what passive building is good at. Passive building strategies are good at reducing space conditioning loads. So you take the baseline, cut out the heating and cooling significantly. I should mention there's other things that are inherent to passive building, best practices like balanced ventilation, air tightness, health, and air quality. Like these things come along with it. We really focus on energy use, but we don't just certify a building based on predicted energy use. There's a lot of things you have to do related to the quality of the building first before we don't only focus on energy. We just don't have anything new to say about air quality or health. Like we let everyone else do that. Like we're focused on energy to add to the equation. Okay, so you take these two buildings, this is the annual load profiles in blue, baseline versus Phius compliant, and then the PV that's offsetting it for net zero. What I want to point out here is that the baseline building, the peak load of the building in blue, it's kind of up there, I can't read the number, but up there around 130, I think, for the passive building is about half the peak load of the building. And if we think about the concept of net zero, these are those same charts kind of swirled around January to December. What we're saying with net zero is that our building uses this blue blob, and we're going to offset it with this yellow blob, right? So they're not the same, right? They're close-ish. Maybe it works, but you can see with passive building, maybe they're a little bit closer together. You reduce the loads. So if we zoom in on one day with these two different buildings, this is a spring day and a fall day, April 15th and October 15th. Baseline building on the left. You can see the building load profile in blue, and then the energy use needed to offset it over the course of the year, PV production, to make it get to zero. So you can see there was quite a bit of excess PV production on this day in April, relative to the actual building load. And then if you move over to the passive building, you have a lower load, slightly, in blue. They're both pretty flat, it's spring. And then the PV production is lower because over the course of the year, you need less PV to offset this building's energy use. Same kind of case in October. But my point here is that with net zero, you're reducing the mismatch, with passive building, you're reducing the mismatch between PV production and energy use, just by using less. Because you use less, you need to produce less over the course of the year to get that to zero. So the net zero, as you reduce the load in the building and flatten the loads, looks closer to zero. It's still not zero, right? It's not zero on a daily basis. Both are zero on an annual basis, but they're getting closer together. So passive or not, net zero buildings rely on grid power for a good amount of the year. Timing-wise, net zero buildings, net zero buildings rely on the grid, passive or not, again, it doesn't matter, whenever the sun's not shining, so half the year, right? And we've done some studies about coincident production and use and how much you can actually use while being produced, and it turns out about 2/3 of the energy needed to provide to the building is coming from the grid in these buildings. You can use about 1/3 of what you're producing. But in the passive case, because we conserved energy first, we cut the load in half, that decreases the grid dependency by half, just by using less. And less renewables are required in the passive building case, so the conservation still matters. And I should, I'll get to that later. Okay, so the other thing is consumers are becoming producers, and there's widespread solar energy, and we all are seeing this, and this is called DER, or Distributed Energy Resources. So what's happening, here's our infamous duck curve. Does everybody know the duck curve? We got a good amount. Okay, so I'm not going to get into this too much. There's a ramping issue, okay? And the issue with ramping, the belly of the duck, is that because we don't have the resources to meet that ramp. We just showed that we have about 1/3 natural gas generation resources. That depends on your region, that mix, and that's the only resource that can meet that ramp, or solar, or storage. So this ramp is getting worse and worse and harder for utilities to meet because they don't have the resources to do it. And this is California, everyone's seen California's. This is from Massachusetts. So this is just a diagram, they predicted where they might be, but this is real from the New England ISO in April of this year. So the duck curve has made its way to Massachusetts just because of the amount of solar that's being introduced into that grid. So it's no longer just a California problem, and it's going to be a problem and an opportunity for all of us soon as we incentivize more and more solar. And again, the challenge is just meeting that ramp. So both turning down for the downward ramp, turning down generation resources, and then ramping those back up. They just don't respond that quickly to change. Okay, so let's look at those two prototypical multifamily buildings again and say, okay, as we introduce more and more of them to be net zero, what does that look like on a spring day? The day that they typically use for the duck curves in March, April, because there's less space conditioning load, but there's a lot of sun. So this is again in Chicago. And the baseline building is on the left, the passive building is on the right. In the baseline building, if we look at that chart, the blue line that kind of hovers around the top is the typical load of that building. There's 1,000 of these buildings, okay? A community. And as we introduce net zero or PV to offset more and more, a larger percent of them, you can see kind of the belly of the duck or the net load go down and down. And what we're left with at the very bottom, the green curve, if 50% of them became net zero with solar energy alone, the ramp that we're left with, you can see is really significant at the end of the day, right? Very, very challenging to meet that. Same buildings, but first conserved, using passive building strategies, flatten the loads, reduce the loads. Same concept is happening, more and more offset with solar. You can see that ramp is significantly different, right? Because there's different loads, different peaks, and less. And they needed less, so there's less of a difference between the PV needed to offset it and the energy being used. So passive buildings can dampen this load, but not, or this issue, but not fully eliminate it. Okay, so not all kilowatt hours are equal. I think we kind of get that, right? Used and produced. Hourly marginal emissions are always going to continue to be dynamic as we add more and more generation resources, and the price to meet those will also be dynamic. So with our current concept of net zero, we really focus on how much. With energy efficiency, it's always how much energy do we use, instead of when do we use it. So if we look at another fake, this is a single day energy use load profile. Let's say they're all brown, they're all the same. Every hour of the day is the same in terms of when you're using energy. But there's different emission factors based on where you are and the load profile of the building. So if you're in a typical conventional fossil fuel-based grid like we are here in Chicago, as you increase the load in the building, the emissions associated with that increases. So you can see kind of, maybe as the load is low, it's green, and then it increases, it gets worse and worse over time as you hit that peak. So in this type of building, what you might want to do, if you're not reducing energy use, you're just shifting it, you could move that to the times of green, right, to actually reduce carbon emissions. So maybe that more ideal load profile for this building is that black line. But then what if you had solar on your roof? Same load profile, same black line here. It could be in the same neighborhood, but they have solar on their roof. Maybe the time that, in the middle of the day now, that's when you have your clean energy because you're producing the energy right on your roof, clean energy, and you can use it on site. So relative to one another, your morning hours are actually dirtier than the middle of your day. So in that building, maybe you want to move more of your energy use to the middle of the day. And so your new load profile would look more like this black line here. But again, they started with the same load profile, right? It just depends on the actual generation resources serving the load at that hour to actually determine the emissions associated with that energy use. So we need to enable buildings to be smart and responsive to signals that tell us green versus red at different times. So that's GEB. Who knows about GEB? Oh, it's so exciting. Okay, so GEB stands for Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings. So essentially what we're doing is we're making the building smart and responsive. This is from Slipstream. They are a local consulting group, so I don't know if any Slipstream's here, but basically what we're trying to do is optimize the energy being used in the building with the supply that's happening at the time. And it depends on what you're trying to do. I think often people would do it to reduce cost, but generally if you're reducing cost, you also reduce emissions. So what you can do essentially is have a central optimizer where building loads can respond to signals from the grid, whether that is cost, whether that is emissions, whatever it might be. Maybe in here, the lighting, we dim it because there's a stress on the grid. Maybe you shut off HVAC, maybe not in here, but at home. Maybe you store more energy because there's excess renewables on the grid. But being able to have that communication with the supply is super critical to facilitating more and more renewables into the grid. If they have excess supply and that's clean, we want to use it, the building end, right? And if they have the next kilowatt hour super, super dirty, we want to know that. Maybe we didn't need to, I don't know, I don't have a good example, run our disco ball, I don't know, run the lobby. Like maybe that didn't have to happen, right? If you had that response to that signal, then you could actually understand the emissions associated with the electricity at that time. So 2 main things in the GEBS toolkit. There's more than this, but related to energy, specifically like related to passive building and is load shifting and load shedding. So on the left, you can see load shifting, and this is really just shifting energy use from one time of the day to the other. And these are for loads that you can't eliminate in a building. So easiest for me to think about is like in a residential application, like doing your laundry. Like you don't care if it's done at 6 a.m. or at 8 p.m. if you just set it and it's like, okay, run when the grid emissions are lowest. Something easy like that. And then load shedding is actually reducing energy use at certain times because stress on the grid is high. So in a GEB scenario, looking at the same, we have power flow one way, we have a GEB over here. There's high stress on the grid, so they say, hey, reduce your load, and the customer reduces their load. Okay? And that's also called demand response, which is not super common in small buildings, but is, I think, fairly common in larger commercial buildings or industrial processes, where they can either just completely shut down because it's very expensive to operate, or reduce load a certain amount at given times because grid stress is high, or really because it's going to cost a lot to operate that building. So when you tie in passive buildings, they're inherently good at doing this, load shedding, load shifting. So if you think about a cooler, a styrofoam cooler's code, the Yeti is passive building, kind of. And I don't mean to offend anybody by that either. But it's really high performance, okay? Thoughtful design, really high performance. And you can put ice in those Yetis and like 4 days later, there's still ice in there. Or like a Yeti coffee cup. It doesn't matter when, like how long you have hot coffee in there, it's like the next day it's hot, okay? Think of passive building like that. So it can shed load no problem. At any given time, doesn't matter. You can take away heating and cooling, the building will ride it out. We do a lot of resilience modeling at Phius, and it's like, it takes days to like drop temperature in those things. So a couple hours, couple minutes, whatever, it doesn't matter. Load shifting also, preconditioning, pre-cooling, preheating spaces, very easy for passive buildings. So when you first combine the nice enclosure, you now have your GEB toolkit is enhanced, I guess. Buildings are being electrified, so just really briefly on this. Water heating, the same way kind of the passive building thermal storage enclosure concept works. Same thing with water heaters. Basically, you can align water heating demand with when clean energy supply is available. Ride out times with less supply, but basically storing extra thermal energy in the water heater and then letting it cool down later. So again, trying to align clean energy supply with the demand in the building. Okay, so this next thing is very important. The peak on the grid is changing. So right now, the grid peak happens in the summer. And this is because most of us use natural gas for heating, right? So the grid peak happens with space conditioning, with air conditioning in summer. When we start to electrify more and more heating systems, this will change. And it will be dramatically larger than the peak we have right now for cooling. So this is going to, I talked about, we have about 3 times the amount of generation capacity that we need right over the course of the year to meet the summer peak. We're also going to electrify buildings, we're going to electrify cars, and then we're going to replace, hopefully, all of it with renewable energy, okay? So this is a big deal. So if we look at just a typical building winter day load, Let's do morning hump, evening hump, using easy numbers here. Let's say the peak is 4 in the typical building, in the passive building it's 2. This is a typical day. Let's say this is the worst case for the winter. When we start to step back and look beyond the building, look at a typical building, what the grid sees, there's 3 of them now. So 4 plus 4 plus 4, the grid sees 12, right? Coincident loads in these buildings. So the grid needs capacity now, we need 12. If we first cut the building load down in half, the peak load into 2, 2 plus 2 plus 2 is 6, right? So the grid now needs 6. Capacity needs 6. We reduce capacity needs by half. And then if we can throw in our GEB concept, maybe we can shift those loads. Shed the load, shift loads is really just shifting loads, trying to show the first building peak isn't happening at the same time as the second or the third. So maybe coincident, those 2, 2, 2 add up to 4, because they're offset a little bit, right? This is just an example of, if you don't believe me, with the reduction in load by a factor of 2 for these passive buildings. We have a 2009 code building studied in the Phius building, and this bottom shows the peaks. The peak heating was about 17 in the baseline, and then the peak heating in the passive was about 5. So about a factor of 3. This is a very real, possible thing to do with buildings, especially in a climate like Chicago. Real opportunity to use passive building principles to shave that load. And if we take our existing building stock and we electrify it without doing anything to the enclosure to energy efficiency, we're talking about that type of load instead of this type of load. All right, so I'm going to briefly touch on microgrids. I am not a microgrid expert. I will be the first one to say that. I work in the building industry. But again, we're trying to tie this all together. So think about it from a one-way flow to now more of a mesh network. Communication at different points, different nodes, a smarter system. So the key components: energy demand from buildings with grid-enabled loads. You got generation, you got storage, hopefully renewable energy generation, but it could be any generation. And then some sort of central optimizer, okay? And this is kind of a complicated diagram, but this might be how energy flows. But essentially the important thing here is that a microgrid is connected to a larger utility grid almost always. What it's trying to do is it's trying to optimize the supply, the storage, and the load within this certain space by essentially looking at what the building loads are and looking at what's available and what makes sense to do. So this microgrid manager, maybe one thing it looks at is, okay, we have another kilowatt hour of energy produced. What do we do with it? If it's a low supply, then it should serve the most critical load on this grid. What is that? I don't know, someone needs to program this and decide those things, right? If it's in a time of excess supply, maybe you store it, either in EVs or in stationary storage. Maybe you shift to non-critical load to use it because it's clean energy. Why not? Maybe you store it by cooling a building a little bit lower than needs to be cooled so that you can let it ride out less space conditioning later. And then when your building adds a new load, how should it be met? Renewable energy, maybe storage. Maybe you say, is it critical? Are they already at their set point? Is it fine? Maybe they shed the load. Depends on what it is. Or maybe it's met by the main utility grid. But the point is that we're optimizing within this little sector to try to dampen the load on the main utility grid. I like when people put their dogs in presentations. So I put my dog in presentation. This is Flynn, asking about the winter peaks. So what about microgrids in the winter peaks? So we saw this, right? Let's look at those same scenarios within a grid structure. So on the far left, we have baseline buildings. So with a typical centralized grid, then we go into baseline building with the GEB technology, and then microgrid with the GEB technology. So we said those peaks, those winter peaks in that building were 4, 4, 4, right? 4 for all those buildings. So the grid's going to see 9 times 4, 36 as a peak capacity. Now if we have the GEB, load shifting, load shedding technology, whether they're shifting it away from this time of peak or shedding it, now the sum of the coincident peaks brought it down to 2 is 18. 2 per building, 18. Now the power and the kind of opportunity with the microgrid is optimization of timing of these peaks within the buildings. So now these peaks aren't all happening at the same time. So the sum of the coincident peaks, now let's say they get 3, 3, 3, they, some sort of shifting of timing. The peak per building is 2, the grid peak, now they're only seeing 3 at the same time, the grid peak is 6. And the main difference between this GEB technology on its own and then the GEB technology plus the microgrid manager is that the GEB might get a signal from the central grid that says the grid stress is high, right? And they can all reduce it at that time. But they don't know what their neighbor's doing, and they don't know, should I reduce it now and then use it again in an hour, or, there's not that optimization within the buildings that the microgrid manager has. You get where I'm going with this. So passive building, we're now shaving that load in half first. So now we have peaks of 2 per building to start on the left. So now the grid peak's 18. Now we're going to use passive building and GEB. Peak of building is 1. So the grid peak is now 9. And then microgrid again, offset the timing, and we can bring that grid peak down to 3. So what I'm getting at here, although this is a hypothetical situation, is that if you tap into the synergy between the passive building, the GEB strategies, and the microgrid optimization, we can reduce the capacity. The grid peak is correlated to the capacity, in this case by a factor of 12. And I know this is all fake numbers, but conceptually, we can significantly reduce the capacity needed at the grid scale to power these buildings. Other things about microgrids, just really briefly. Resilience is huge. If a line goes down, they can island and be on their own and still run the buildings. Resource utilization improvement, matching the demand to the supply. Optimizing smaller areas. Again, like a centralized grid can't optimize millions and millions of square footage. Energy independence, I think, is really critical. Being in less vulnerability to a central utility and costs. And then also bringing the generation closer to the load. So we talked about transmission congestion. There's going to be a ton of investment in transmission capacity to get, as we have larger scale renewables, and reducing the need for all of those lines. Okay, so solutions. What I'm really talking about is optimization at each level. And we're used to thinking of the building level, right, or a lot of us in this room. So passive building optimizes at the building level, optimizing the design to reduce building loads. We know how to do this. If you don't, go to Phius' website and figure it out. We have training. So we're reducing the demand in the building and the renewable supply required to meet it. First step. Second step, taking those remaining loads in the building and making them smart, making them optimized, making them be able to respond to generation capacity available. So enabling the demand to align with the supply. And then the third is optimizing not just the building part of it, but also the supply and the demand to maximize the use of the infrastructure and minimize emissions. And I will say, not all microgrids are out there to minimize emissions. There's a lot of other good reasons for it. This is kind of where Phius keys into it a little bit more, but I mean, resilience, there's a lot of good reasons outside of minimizing emissions, but this is my perspective on it. So bringing these all together is really where we harness the greatest benefit. I'm going to skip this for the sake of time. Okay. So just to kind of wrap it up, if we keep business as usual on the grid, as the grid load increases, maybe we can use the renewables first, and then we need to continue to call upon fossil fuels to meet the remaining load. If we first cut building loads down, maybe we can cut out some of the fossil fuel base, right? And decrease the stress on the grid. If we then add GEB, maybe we can decrease a little bit more reliance on fossil fuels, rely a little bit more on storage. We have a lot more flexibility in our building loads. That we can resource capacity, or reduce capacity needed in terms of resources. And then if we tie them all together, maybe we can get to the point where at the least cost and least amount of infrastructure needed, we have low stress on the grid, we can run with renewables and storage. So just want to leave you all with this. I strongly believe there's a ripple effect of conservation. I meant to mention this in the beginning, but as PV started to get cheaper, people started to come to us like, well, what's Phius gonna do? PV is so cheap that like, you guys are just, no one's gonna care about efficiency. And I just wanna strongly urge and tell you guys, efficiency is still there. It's not sexy like people want it to be, but like, it's still there, and it's still very, very important. And I think this is why. So, as we conserve, it means less generation, less storage, less transmission capacity needed through the whole system. So it ripples through the whole system. So we take a baseline building, reduce it by 40%, now you need 40% less PV, 40% less storage, 40% less transmission capacity. It ripples through the whole system. It's not just a building payback model. And that is it.
Time check.
Yeah, I don't remember my phone.
We can handle just a couple questions and then we need to get to our final presentation.
It's fine, I'll be on the road.
Excellent. Yeah, you can hunt these down if you have more intricate questions, but yeah, we could maybe field just a couple. We'll smile and then Mike.
Thank you, Lisa, for the presentation. For Chicago, the baseline, like the base demand, how clean the energy for that section?
There's a lot of nuclear, so it depends, in terms of CO2 emissions, not as bad maybe as other places, but it's not, nuclear can't respond to kind of the intermittency of renewables, so I think it's going to be a really big challenge. You can't just rely on nuclear and renewables, so it's not super clean. Yeah, that's my best answer.
The website that you mentioned for presentation, the
Yeah.
ISO,
Yeah.
that's for all states.
So there's different ISOs that operate different regions, so they all have their own websites and they all have their own markets that generation researchers like bid into. So I showed the New England ISO and I showed the California ISO. Chicago is part of the PJM interconnection, which I don't know why this one doesn't call itself an ISO, but there's also a Midwest ISO, so there's tons.
Hey, thanks, Lisa, that was excellent. Enjoyed that, except for your passive buildings and your microgrid and stuff, do you use a hourly rate for energy supply in your operations?
No, but I'm saying you should.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to manage like building operational flexibility, you know, it seems like you would blend in the, not just the hourly price, maybe the 5-minute price and demand response programs into your
Yes.
system.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, price is a really good signal because we have it readily available. Like, I'd prefer to use emissions, but that's just not something that we can get readily
Yeah,
available
price
on
for
any grid.
Market signal, right? Like-
Yeah, price is a pretty good indicator of emissions. Pretty good.
And then for, you know, you mentioned multifamily residential places. How prevalent do you see PV going into like larger vertical office buildings? How prevalent do you see that coming in the next few years?
I think it's pretty prevalent. As incentives rise, I mean, I don't know about like downtown Chicago, but I would say almost 75% of projects we see with Phius probably have PV in some way, whether it's rooftop or building integrated. That's becoming more of a thing for towers. It's very prevalent.
The windows?
Yep. Well, the windows or just vertical panels on the facade.
Great. We'll close questions there. Sorry.
You guys are already cut into beer time, I think, so
No, this is wonderful. Thank you so much for your presentation. All right.